Hi, this is Ted Patterson of Critical Path Training. In this 60-minute webinar, we're going to look at writing advanced expressions with Microsoft Flow. Now, I have a GitHub repository. So if you want to get the slides, and there's a couple files I'm going to use in my demos, you can basically navigate to github.com, Critical Path Training, Advanced Flow Expressions. And what you're going to see is that the slides are available both as a PowerPoint slide deck and as a PDF. So if you want to go ahead and review that afterwards, if you want to use my slide deck and present it to your local user group, I think that would be absolutely great. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back into the slide deck. So one of the things that we are going to use, also let me go ahead and make sure I open this slide deck here and start it back up again. Sorry. So we're going to go over, first of all, just some basic flow fundamentals. We're going to talk about writing flow expressions. So this is where things get to be tricky. We're going to talk about converting between types. One of the things that we have to deal with is working with different arrays and lists. And then we're going to just kind of talk about some advanced techniques. Now I have to do a shout out to thank Steven Siciliano from the program group. He came up with the idea for this talk. He's given it several times, so I've been able to go through his talk and harvest the important points inside there. So I just wanted to pay tribute to him for doing that work. Okay, one other thing is that, if you like this session, we have some deep dive PowerApps and flow training that goes way beyond the basics. And there's basically 4 lectures a day, 2 days in a row, and lots of time for you, building flows and building PowerApps, so lots of hands-on. Now, everyone here is coming to an advanced flow session has probably worked with flow to some degree. So what is flow? It's this service that Microsoft has created, to let us automate various processes, maybe a business process. And with flow, we build these little components or units, which are called flows. And generally, what is the motivation for building some type of a flow? I want to look, and if something with my data seems, out of whack, I want to send a notification to a mobile phone or an email. Maybe I want to copy data, from one SharePoint list into a SQL database, or I want to take data from an XML file and convert it to a JSON file, or I want to clean up data, so a real common use of building flows is to create a flow that works on a timer, and once an hour we go to a SharePoint list and we look at the data and we kind of patch up, whatever needs to be cleaned. We can automate approvals, and I'm not going to get into the approval aspect of flow today, but certainly that's an important part. Now, when we start building flows, what are the building blocks? Well, first of all, there's the services. And that's basically the places that you're pulling data from and pushing data to. So they're your sources and destinations. You're not really building those, but you're interacting with them. Now, when you build a flow, the first thing you have to add in is a trigger. What starts the flow running? Okay, and then you start adding actions, and quite often we add many actions in a row. It's also possible to add a condition. So for instance, if you have a flow that's triggered by a new expense item being added to a SharePoint list, your condition can look at the amount, and if the amount column is greater than a certain value, we can go down one path of execution, and if not, we can go ahead and terminate the flow or go down a different path of execution. Okay, and then there's also looping. We're going to see that there's 2 different styles of looping that you can create. Okay, now, when you start working with Microsoft Flow, let me go ahead and move back over to my browser here. Note that you have all the different flows that you've created, or you're the co-owner of, and we're able to create new flows. So let's say that I create a brand new flow. So I'm going to keep it simple in the very first one. And when I build a flow, I'm going to build it from scratch. But yet, when you build a flow, the very first thing you have to add is a trigger. So let's go ahead and add a button inside here. So we'll go ahead and we'll add a button. And once again, not the most exciting demo in the world so far. Okay, let's see if we can change that. So this is going to be demo 1. Also note that they leave very ambiguous names. So I'll just kind of call this one demo 1. And, we want to play around with triggers here. Okay, now let's add a step. So what I want to do as quickly as possible put in a step so we can run the flow and kind of see that it's running. So I'll just send a email to myself, and then we'll be able to go, into our inbox and kind of confirm what happened. And so, there is test and also inside the body. For now, we'll just go ahead and add test and save. Okay, now for testing this, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this tab. So in the other tab, we can jump over and look at our Outlook inbox. And I've been doing a bunch of testing here. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to move back to our flow. And now that I've saved it, notice up top in the right, there's this test button. Let's go ahead and quickly test our flow. Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll test the flow inside here. And, what we should be able to see is our flow is run. Okay, that's great. Let's go ahead and confirm that. And once we run the flow, we're successful. We should be able to, go back here and confirm, that we have a new email that has arrived. Sometimes it takes a second to get inside there. There it is. Okay, now remember that when you build a flow, okay, you're thinking this is a very basic demo. Show me something interesting. So let's say that I built this flow. A flow has to start with a trigger. Let's say that I don't like this trigger. So note that you can delete the trigger, and it for a moment of time, makes your flow invalid because the flow has to start with a trigger. But now I can do something such as let's get rid of that trigger. And what is the one that I want in? Now I want to put it on a schedule, and I want to use recurrence. And what I have is I want to be able to now, run this flow once a minute without any user interaction. Okay. Now, depending on your flow plan, you generally can go as quickly as once a minute or maybe once every 5 minutes if you're on the free plan. So being able to, get to higher, frequency, going multiple times per minute might mean that you have to get on a higher plan. Okay. But now what you'll see is if we wait for 30 seconds or if we wait for a minute, this flow should go ahead and be able to fire inside there. Okay. Now, if this flow is running, and I'm not sure if I want to wait until we see the second one. Here's the second one. It's come up inside there. Let's try a third type. So let's go up here, and I'm going to go ahead and remove this. And let's say that what I'd really like is to be a request. So when an HTTP request hits this, I'd like to go ahead and run my flow. So we'll go ahead and we'll add the HTTP request. Now, when you do this, you can add all kinds of input parameters that are coming from the query strings or the request body. For this demo, I'm just going to kind of leave it simple, and we'll go ahead and save as it is. And note that before you save, you're not really sure what the URL is. But now that we have saved our flow, it has a URL. Let's now go back here, and go just, inside of the browser, put the URL inside there, and go ahead and run this right here. And, what we should see is that, now we're able to get inside there and the actual get. So it looks like I'm still getting an error, which means that if we go back into our flow, just to make this demo work inside here, there is some particular request, what an HTTP request is received. Okay, and then show advanced options. What method do I want to allow? I want to allow a get. We'll just go to the top URL, so we won't have to save that inside there. But now that we've done that, let's go back, one more time, and we'll refresh this. And, I'm not going to go into the details, but once again, you can accept input parameters from your request trigger, and then there is a response action, that you can push things back inside there. But what we should be able to see now, is every time I go ahead and make that request, it's going to basically trigger my flow. Okay. So what we saw is that the basics say that when you create a flow, you have to start with a trigger, and there's lots of different types of triggers, and then we start adding actions inside there. Okay. Now, one of the Microsoft product team people is running some kind of competition in the industry, and here's kind of the award-winning flow over the last month. but it's kind of a good example of, as you start writing kind of more, production level flows, we have something where we want to run this flow once a day or once an hour because we want to check our data. And then we're going to send an HTTP request to basically get back, some particular state. We might have to use parse JSON, to basically parse out the data. So one of the things about flow is that there's a lot of hands-on manipulating the data. So while PowerApps and Flow are kind of billed as no code, don't need to be a developer, you'll find that Flow, will often drop you into a space where, having the background and kind of intuition of the developer, is very, very helpful. Okay, and then to finish off this first section, what we saw is that, we can have automated flows. So we can have a flow that runs when a SharePoint list item is added. We could have scheduled flows that run on a periodic basis. We can have instant flows that run when someone clicks a button. And then we can also have automated flows such as the HTTP request inside there. Okay, so now let's talk more about expressions. So the first thing we have to say is that inside of a flow, we have steps. So triggers and actions are both considered steps. So what happens first is the trigger is activated and the flow wakes up. Now, the trigger is going to have outputs. Let's say that it's a file in a SharePoint document library, and you're basically having a trigger that triggers every time a new file was uploaded. So the trigger has outputs like file name and file size and a binary, piece of content called file content. Now, let's say that I add an action. And as I start configuring the properties of that action, I see as inputs all the outputs of the previous step. And then when we get to the next step, action 1 has added in a couple of outputs of its own. And so action 2 kind of sees the aggregation, of all the outputs from previous steps. Okay. Now, when we start writing flow expressions, we have to learn some of the basics. Converting between types is not always necessary, but it's sometimes necessary. We want to perform simple inline calculations, string manipulations. If you want to create a unique ID, there's a GUID function to quickly create a new one. There is a random number function if you need a random number between 1 and 100. Okay. There's also techniques for handling optional values. So you don't want your code to blow up. So there's something you can do that says, if this is a null value, don't try to go in and reach into a collection and experience a runtime error. Okay. We can also write conditional statements with if. Now, the language that we work with is not the PowerApps expression language. Unfortunately, PowerApps and Flow are very different. The language for Flow started up in Azure with something called Azure Logic Apps. And Flow is kind of the baby brother of Azure Logic Apps, and they kind of put it into a user context as opposed to an application context. But they both use the same language, which is known as workflow definition language. So once again, you can't copy and paste expressions from the PowerApps expression bar into the Flow expression text box because it's not the same language. Now, WDL, workflow definition language, is more powerful, that's the good news, but more complicated than the PowerApps expression language. So some of the basics is that PowerApps overloads simple operators that you're familiar with, and WL does not. Also, WDL requires single quotes. Okay, so when you start writing an expression, this is not going to work because you can't use double quotes. This works because you can use single quotes to basically put static text into an expression. Now, this you would think would work, but that doesn't work because the plus operator is not supported. Sometimes I think, oh, wait a second, I'm not in C#, I'm in VB or Power BI Desktop, and so I just need the ampersand. That doesn't work either. Neither of those operators are overloaded. So here's one of these points that people that start using Flow kind of have a very negative reaction, and that is to parse things together, you've got to use concat. To add two numbers, you can't say 2 plus 2. You have to say add 2, 2. So once again, it just takes a little mindset to get into. Now, when we start adding expressions, there is dynamic content, and then there is the expressions dialog inside there. And so one of the things that we have to kind of get comfortable with is when we can just add in dynamic content, as a indivisible unit, and then when we have to get into the expression bar and start writing expressions and taking other dynamic content and parsing it into the expressions that we write. Now, what we're going to focus on here, is the the expression dialog inside there. So here's where you're going to type things in. So for instance, I want to put two things together. Let's go ahead and I'm going to use an example with a SharePoint list. So let's say that I move over here into SharePoint, and I've got this contacts list with a couple different contacts inside there. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new flow. And so for this new flow, I want to call get items. And let me spell get items in a more standard fashion. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and we'll call get items, and inside of SharePoint, we should see the get item inside there. This is a trigger. So what I need to do here is a button. Okay, so once again, let's just kind of start with a simple example where I create a button, and then we're going to go ahead and call get items inside there. And what have I done wrong inside here? Okay, I'm going to go to flow buttons and create this based on a button. Sorry, this is taking longer than it should. Okay, now my new step, this one will be the get items. So what we're going to do is we're going to reach into this SharePoint list, and we're going to basically start pulling out some items from inside there. So note that depending on the day of the week, this get items might resolve your site, and then if it resolves the site, it might resolve the list, it might not. I find that a little bit finicky behavior, but I have a list, and the list name is contacts, so I'll just go ahead and type that in. Okay, so now we've basically gotten this list of items inside here. So what we'd like to do, is we'd like to look at, something inside. So next step that I'm going to add in, is going to be a compose. So the idea of a compose step is that it allows you to take data that's, already in various outputs and start combining them together. Okay, so let's go ahead and use compose inside here. And so, what are going to be the inputs right here? And so let's say that I now want to write an expression. And so, what I'd like to do, I'd like to concatenate something together. Okay, so, you can type in, and notice that if you're staying dynamic content, it doesn't work. You have to switch over to the expression box. And then as I type in concat, what we're going to see here is that I start getting IntelliSense. There is this very annoying IntelliSense that kind of covers up that you kind of get used to because, as you can see, once you move the cursor around a little bit, it goes away. But most people find that fairly annoying. But now let's say I want to drill inside and pull some content inside there. So what I can do is I can go to dynamic content, and notice that there is this value and list of values inside there. So now I can basically say get items, and that's going to get all these different items inside. Now also I can use array syntax, and so what I've done there is I basically used a square bracket, and the idea is that get items returns this list or this array of objects. And so it's a zero-based array. And so if I now kind of go, and pull that inside, let's go ahead and choose the get expression. And, without having to run and push something out to email, let's go ahead and do a test. So we're going to go ahead and run this right here. And as we go ahead and run this, I'll perform the trigger action. Great. Go ahead and run, pull list items back. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of use the, what I use for debugging, which is, looking at a run after the fact and kind of seeing the data that was built up inside there. So there kind of tells me my was failed, and it basically says, as you're moving together, cannot be evaluated because 0 cannot be selected. Okay, now let me go into another flow that does this. So let's say that what I wanted to do was to delete a single item from a SharePoint list. Okay, so now under Get Items, we have the same thing. Under Delete, now we have this issue where, do you want to delete everybody? Or do you just want to delete, one thing inside there? If I go ahead and open this up, what we can see here is that we have this body Get Items. So basically that gets the object from the Get Items action. And if you want to get at the data values, you basically have to say value, and notice that value, is case sensitive. Also note that the question mark there is basically saying that if Get Items is a null value, just return a null value. Don't continue to go down in a null value and try to find things that are going to break inside there. But the idea here is that once you get into the value, and then you can specify, what is the column that you want inside here. Okay, now you've seen this. Let's go ahead and test this right here. Before we test this, if we go back to SharePoint and we see Carol Cole, seems to currently be the first person, inside that list. Let's go ahead and execute that right here. And, now that we've run that inside there, you can see the flow running. It's calling Get Items. It's calling Delete Items. My flow ran successfully. And once again, the way I like to, troubleshoot or just really kind of see what's going on is I can come down here and I can kind of see, there's the value. So that's what we're reaching inside. And then we have an ID, but we have more than one value right here. So what you can see here is that, we were able to pull out, just one particular ID, and the technique I used was just to use the 0 element to pull the first thing out. And now if we go back over here and we refresh, and we had Carol before, and it might take another second before she disappears. Okay, somehow maybe she was the second one. Okay, but hopefully that kind of gets the point across about having to work with paths as you go down into an object. Now, if you want to work with strings, you can call concat, and it doesn't just take 2 parameters, but you can say parameter 1, comma, parameter 2, so you can put 5 or 6 different things and parse them all together. If you want to parse text out, there's substring, to lower, to upper. If I want to search through a string, there is an index of. So if I say look through the string for the letter P and it finds it, it basically tells me what starting place it's at. And there's also a way to create a GUID identifier just by calling the GUID function. Now, here's something that, once again, you just have to get used to, and that is when you want to do simple arithmetic, there are functions: min, max, add, sub, multiply, divide, and there's the modulo. So it just kind of makes for writing more things. And the other thing that I would say is that, given the fact that the text box, that you have to work within is so small, and kind of let me show you kind of some other examples right here. Let's say that I now want to do something a little bit more intricate. I want to join some emails together. Here is a concat. If I, click on this, it's going to bring things up inside here. But once things get, larger than they can fit inside there, bring it out into Notepad or some other editor, to be able to look at your expression. And certainly we all hope that there's a better kind of a full screen or a larger editing experience, in the near future. Okay. Now, let's say I wanted to do some type of a Boolean inside there. So, let's say we have this case right here. And in our particular case, let me go ahead and move back into something where what I would like to do is basically get items from a SharePoint list. And when we get the items, basically we want to figure out, if there are any items in that list. Now, there are some cases where you can go into this condition and you can basically just use the basic mode to say this equals that, but what you're going to find, let's go into advanced mode for a second, is that this sometimes allows you to do it much, much quicker, if you can just type in, but this also gives you flexibility, to achieve Boolean conditions you can't get elsewhere. So being able to, in our case right here, we'll say something such as, we'll look at the items that are coming back. So body get items. How many items do we have? So because body get items value returns a list, it's an array, I can call length and see if that's equal to 0. Because if it's equal to 0, we want to go down this path. You're just going to send an email and say there were no customers. But if there are, items in that particular list, we want to do something different inside there. Okay. So once again, when you're working inside of the advanced mode, generally you have to start your expressions with a @ sign. Behind the scenes, everything is tracked as JSON. And some of the reasons, that we can't use double quotes is because the underlying JSON document or, object that is capturing all you're doing, is basically using the, double quotes to take what you're doing and save it into a file. So when you use double quotes, it basically throws off, how they're saving the overall flow logic. Okay. There's also some escaping rules. So let's say that if you see up there, if I have a substring and I want to pull out, something inside there, if I want to use a apostrophe or a single quote inside of a little string, I just put 2 in a row, and that basically gives me a single quote. Using spaces is not allowed in action names, so those is why they have underscore inside there. And sometimes if you look at this bottom example, you might want to set the header for an outgoing HTTP request to @OData. But because @ is the escaping character, you have to use @ twice to actually put a literal @ sign, into something. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit more about converting between types inside there. So we have a whole bunch of functions for handling type conversions, and I want to change something to a string, to a float. Now you don't always have to perform type conversions. If you're taking a numeric value and just kind of implicitly converting that into a string, that will work. But you can't go back the other way, without an explicit cast. Not all strings can be converted to numbers. Therefore you have to do an explicit cast. The flow runtime won't do it for you. Okay. Now here's a chart. Once again, I have to put homage to our friend Steven in the program group for creating this. But what you can see is that if you have a string, if you go down the left column, that's the thing that you have. And if you go across the top column, that's what you want to convert to. So if I, want to do something, such as go from a data URI, that's what we have, inside of PowerApps when you take pictures and you have that photo, that's a data URI. But I want to basically move it to binary content so we can basically copy it, back up into a SharePoint site. Okay. Now, before I do the demo with the data URI binary to binary, just a couple of words about working with dates. So I just find as we work with flows, when was a document created? When was it checked out? When was this happening? When was that? So I find that I'm just constantly having to deal with dates, and then also with the issue that you have to worry about what time zone you're in many cases. So we can basically call the UTC now, which gives me the time at Greenwich Mean Time, but quite often I want to then translate it because I'm on the East Coast of the United States. So there is convert time zone functions, and there's also convert time zone actions that you can use. What I found is that, a year ago, I would write 3 different actions, and now I find, once you get better at expressions, you might be able to, do everything in a single compose action just by writing more advanced expressions. Okay. And there's also a format date time function. So if you have a date time object and you want it to be pretty, to have month and day and time, you're able to do that. Here's just a little example of converting time zones, and there is an explicit convert time zone action. So if you're not really up on writing expressions, you could use that. But also if you get good at writing expressions, quite often you won't be necessary to create that extra action, because you can get the same effect, by writing an expression, that does the time zone conversion. Okay, now here's an example where we have this thing inside of PowerApps. So let's go ahead and run through this next example. So with this example, we're going to create a flow in just a second. But as we create that flow inside there, let me, in a different browser window, let's go over to PowerApps. So here, inside of PowerApps, I have this little application. I didn't want to create this in front of you for time reasons, so I have kind of a pre-created app inside here. Okay, so this is going to use my camera. Okay, so here I am in my office, and the way that this works is if I click on this particular picture right here, what it's going to do is set the picture image in a variable, and then I can take it and I'm going to basically, push it up to SharePoint. Okay, now this already has some code inside there, but let's go ahead and remove this. And let me kind of write the function a second time. So let's say that we have this button, and so what I'm going to do is when we click this button, note that we've already put the image. So let's go back up to on select. I basically took the camera photo and I just stuck it in something called last image inside here. Okay, now with that inside, let's go ahead and move back over into Flow. Let's now go down and look at this upload photo to SharePoint. So here, one of the things that you can do is you can have a trigger, which is a PowerApps button trigger. Okay, now we're going to create the file name inside here. And actually, I'm just stealing this so I can recreate this from scratch. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create the same flow, but I want you to kind of see it from scratch. So we'll go ahead and we'll create it from blank. And so this one that we're going to create is going to be a PowerApps button. And the big advantage of the PowerApps button over the other ones is that as you start adding your data in, there's some really neat things that we can do as far as being able to create parameters to pass data from PowerApps into the flow that you're creating. Okay, now the next thing that we want to do is I'm going to use a compose object, and with our compose object, let's go ahead and add this inside there. And now that we have our inputs here, we're going to go to the expression, and we're going to go ahead and add this expression inside there. So the idea here is that I need a file name. And I could go down the road of doing something tricky with getting the time and date and putting that inside, but an easier way would be just take photo, create a new GUID, put PNG inside there, and now I've got that. Okay, now that we've got that, our next step is going to be, let's go ahead and create a file, inside of a SharePoint document library. And just to make the demo a little bit more exciting, let's go ahead and move back to SharePoint. Let's go ahead and create a new document library. So I'll say add an app. and we will create a picture library, and we'll call this Ted's Photos. And once we've created this picture library named Ted's Photos, what I'd like to be able to do, is quickly upload some photos inside here. Okay, and now let's go ahead and move back to our flow here. So now this is going to be create file. When we call create file, and we should see SharePoint, we should see create file inside here. It would be just as easy for me to create this and basically upload it to OneDrive. But there is my site. We go ahead and we drop this down, and there is Ted's Photos right here. Great. Okay, now what is the name of the file? So here, I've already created the name of the file. That's what that compose thing was for inside here. Note that at this point that I've done that, I can't come up here and rename, because I've already included that somewhere else. So if you're going to rename something, let's go back here and rename, and this is going to be, get file name inside here. Do that, before you add it down inside here, because you can break things afterwards if you don't do that. Okay, now finally, here's what the whole demo is about. So we need to get a value, which is binary data. Okay, so now we're going to go into PowerApps. And so here's the neat thing about the PowerApps trigger, is that currently the function that we're going to call in PowerApps to call this has no parameters. But if I go ahead and click on that right here, it creates a parameter. Now here, I can't really just use the parameter as is, because it is what we call a, data URI. So instead, I delete this, and the important part is I already created this parameter. Okay, so now we'll go up into expressions, and now we have a data URI to binary. Open and close the quotes. We'll kind of go to the left arrow, right arrow to get rid of that obnoxious thing up top there. Now we'll go back to dynamic expressions, create file, and now we've basically done the conversion inside here. Let's go ahead and save our work. Okay, and now we'll go ahead and PowerApps or Flow has created this big long name telling me all the stuff I've done. Hopefully at some point it will enable editing. So this is going to be, my SP upload. And ABC, I've created some other ones. I'm just going to put something in there so I know exactly what it is. Okay, so now that we've saved that, let's go ahead and move back inside here. I'm going to go ahead and move back, into my button. Under Action, we're now going to say, let me go ahead and create a flow. And it basically lists all the flows, that have been created with the PowerApps button trigger. So there's the one right inside there. And note that it adds, and now I have to say, what is the file content? And remember that I had the last photo. That's just basically the photo off the camera inside here. And now, if I've done everything correctly inside here, I should be able to wave, say hi. We should be able to click this button inside here. And now, if we go back into our SharePoint site, and where are you, SharePoint site? Ted's Photos. And now you can kind of see, there's the photo that I put inside there. So once again, knowing how to, do the conversion, makes something pretty easy, but it's impossible to get it done, until you've done that conversion inside there. Okay, next topic. Let's talk a little bit more about working with arrays. So an array, it's just basically a sequence of items, and we have this array syntax, where arrays are zero-based. The first item is item 0, item 1, item 2, and so on. Now, sometimes you're just working with simple arrays, a array based on, a bunch of strings. Now, also, you can have arrays of objects which are more complicated to deal with. Now, let's say that we go back to one of these demos that I was working on, and let's say that in particular, I'm going to go back to this one particular demo where I am going to delete a first item from a SharePoint list. Let's go ahead and open that up. Okay, now notice that you have get items. Now, what I have here is actually something you had to work a little harder to get. Because let's say that I do this. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. And now I have get items. So basically, we're going to go to that SharePoint list, and we're going to get a bunch of items. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to add a delete item. And there's something that's not a match here because get items returns multiple items. Delete item is really for deleting a single item. Okay, so now we go down here, and we basically are able to add in, and this demo is going to be done on the contacts list inside. Okay, and once we get the contacts list here, it wants to know the ID. So now here's where something is going to happen all of a sudden. I have an ID here, but this ID, you have once for each item in the list. So what's going to happen when I take that and I drag it and drop here? It automatically adds this for each loop around it, which is what we call the apply to each. And now if I go ahead and run this right here, let's go ahead and test out our work. If we go back and now we kind of take a look at the contacts list. Okay, and now we go back to our flow, and let's go ahead and save. Let's go ahead and test our flow. And as we test our flow right here, as we're doing these operations, quite often we can kind of see them play out in front of us. Okay, now as it runs our flow right here, you can kind of see it's going through this apply to each. 1, 2, 3, my flow ran successfully, great. If we go back to one of these tabs here, I've opened so many different tabs. Let me go ahead and find the one tab that has the list, and we'll go ahead and refresh. So you can kind of see how easy it is, to do a apply to each. Now, let's say you don't want that for each behavior. That's where you have to go, into the expression bar inside there. So let's say I go back to this flow right here, and that's not what I wanted. I wanted to delete, specific items. Now, one thing we could do is inside of get items, you could add query filter data, by saying something like, find leads inside there, where both the email and the work phone are blank, and go ahead and delete those. So you could basically put the filtering inside here, but let's say that we want to do something a little different. It might be a little contrived, but once again, we're going to add in the delete action or delete item. But now we don't want to delete all the items. We don't want that for each loop, being created inside there. So we're going to have to basically write an expression inside there. Okay. Once again, we'll add the pieces that we need inside here. Okay. And now, once again, if I just add the ID, it's not going to work out. So let's look at the syntax right here. So the syntax is, first of all, go to the body of the action called get items and find the value. And if there is no value, return a null. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's go to one particular item. So if I say 0, it's the first item in the list. Then once I get to that first item in the list, I'm going to need the ID inside there. Okay. Now I think inside of the GitHub repo, I was, I should have added something inside there. It looks like I did not. But the idea is that, this syntax right here, I guess I could be manly and try to type this in. Okay, so basically we go to ID, we go to expression, and now we have the body. And with the body, what is the thing? It is, get underscore items. Once we've got that, question mark, and now square brackets, single, and we want the value. Okay, so now we kind of got up to the list itself. And so now we're going to dig into the array. And so now we'll go ahead and specify, give me, the first thing inside there. And then once again, this piece right here, is now going to look for a specific thing inside there, a specific column. And we go ahead and we choose OK. And I think I'm missing one piece right here, which is the, gosh, I'm not seeing exactly where my body get items. Okay. If I see the error right here, Ted didn't. Okay, let's go back here and add that inside there. Go ahead, choose OK, and then all of a sudden it works. Okay, and now what we'd have, is something that can go back. That failure was from the last time around, but we're assuming now that we can go ahead and test our work, and now, we're just pulling one thing out of that particular array. Okay. If you have lists, there's also ways to join lists together and do, something like string parsing inside there. It's also possible to do filtering. So I showed you in get items. What would be preferred is that when you call to SharePoint or you call to SQL or you call to Azure Active Directory, trying to put your filtering, in, the request that goes off to the service, so the service can do the filtering and ordering and send it back to you. So if you're working with SharePoint lists, you're able to add filter query parameters, that are recognized as OData filter parameters. Okay. There's also a filter array action. So don't use that as your lead, because that assumes all the data has been brought back, into where your flow is running. So you don't want to bring back 100,000 items and then use filter array. You'd rather send the request across the network to basically bring back just the items you need. But once again, if you have an array, it gives you the ability, to filter that. Okay. There's also ways that you can transform arrays. For instance, if you have data, let's go back and look at an example there. And in our case right here, let's look at something that can, basically save a SharePoint item as JSON. Let's say create object you can compose. This is the demo I wanted to show right here. Okay, so let's say we get all the items, in a SharePoint list. So one of the things that we might want to do, is basically get some items. And if there are no items in my list, sorry, I'm jumping around a bunch, I'm going to call this workflow that I'm going to look at last, which is the call contact get times, just so I can put some more data, inside of that list. Okay, but now what we want to see is that we basically call in get items, and there is a initialize variable action. And so here, I want to create a list of email addresses. So basically, we're going to for each through all the different SharePoint list items. We're going to take each email address, and we want to basically create a semicolon delimited list, so I can quickly take it and put it into an email. Okay, so now we're going to do an apply to each. Now, note that when you use initialize variable, it has to be at the top level, so it can't be in a condition or in any other child scope. But now we do an apply to each. And so with apply to each, what we can do is we can take the email address. And the other thing to note is that when you are inside of apply to each, all of a sudden there's this new function that appears, which is called item. So here we'd like to take the email of each user and append it together with a semicolon. Okay. And once again, we create a variable, and then each time we go through, we're just appending more things into the variable, and then we're going to go ahead and send an email. So let's go ahead and run this flow right here. And so if we go ahead and we run this, and then we go back and we look at our email, what we should be able to see, is that inside of this contacts list, we have all these different users, and we kind of see all these email addresses. So maybe I want to broadcast an email, to everybody at once. We come back here, and you can kind of see, here is, what I have built. I can go ahead and take this. Generally, I would have added that, into the senders or CC line. But just to show, we've kind of done some business productivity, is I add these inside, and all of a sudden, it's able to, resolve those email addresses inside. Okay. Now, let's say that I want to go through one more neat demo. And so with this demo, what I want to first of all show is that I have a little test API, which is at HTTPS subliminal systems Azure websites.net API customers. So what you can kind of see here is that we just use this for our classes, but subliminal systems Azure websites, I can basically make an HTTP request, and get back JSON data. So with that, let's go back and let's take a look at this thing, which is called Get New Contact from Web API. So with this, we basically have something that when an HTTP request is received, it's the trigger. Okay, now that's not that important yet. That's going to be important for the follow-up of the demo when I try to call this flow from another flow. But for now, just imagine it was on a trigger. So first of all, when I call into this API, there is about 300 or 400 different customers inside there. And if I just want a random custom generator, I can basically just kind of pick a number. So we're going to pick a random number, which is then going to arbitrarily return something back to us. So what you can see here is that if we look at this expression, it's just using the rand function. Give me a random number between 1 and 380. Okay, next thing, let's go ahead and do an HTTPS. But now what is the URL going to be? So the URL, you can see down here, is we're basically just kind of taking that, random number that we've generated inside there, and we're basically just going to use it to build the URL. Here, what do I want? I want the accept header to be application/JSON. Now, when the result comes back, one of the things that we can do is we can parse the JSON. And, typically you need some object. For instance, if I open up this particular object right here, and you kind of have something which is a JSON object, you can then take it over and use a sample payload, to kind of build this out. Okay. But now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and do a create item. Okay, and we're just basically going to create a item, inside of the contacts list inside there, and we're going to add different things, including the web service doesn't really have this notion of the full name, so we're going to start parsing things like that together. Okay, so if I go ahead and I test this, let's go ahead and run this and test it. What we should be able to see, is that it should be able to go out, call to the web service and do what we need it to do. Okay. Why are you not running? Let me try it one more time. Okay, so what I need to do is take this flow and test it. And once this runs, what we should be able to see is that I can run this, which basically does the HTTP request, creates a random number, parses the JSON, creates the SharePoint item when it comes back. Okay, and see how action is forming. This may take a few minutes. Let's go back and I guess the test is still running. It's taking a second. What I want to do after this demo, is done, we kind of seen that it ran successfully, is I want to then show how we can call this from something else. Okay, so here's what we had before. Looks like that other one is still running inside there. Let's see if we go back and take a look at that. Get new contact from Web API. Okay, why is this not running? Let me hold on. Okay, one more time. Let me try to. Oh, it's not running because it's an HTTP request. Okay. Sorry, that was a senior moment on my part. If it was a button, I could run it. Since it's an HTTP request, you have to hit the HTTP to basically run that. But that is going to lead into my next and last demo. So once again, let's kind of review. At the beginning of this, I have when an HTTP request is received. So basically, that's what's going to trigger this inside there. So I can copy this URL. Now, let's go back to a second flow that is going to call this. So now the second flow we're going to look at is call new get new contact flow 5 times. So in our case right here, this one will be something I can manually trigger. Well, now I don't want to call it once. I want to call it multiple times. So here I can create a compose object, and here I'm just creating an array. Note that, as you create these, if you want to create an array, it's just comma 1, comma 2, comma 3, comma 4, comma 5, comma 6, and then close the square bracket. But now what we can do is we can use this for a apply to. Do I need the values of 1, 2, 3, 4 down inside? No, we're just kind of using the array, as a counter. And now down inside here, apply to each, and now we're going to run HTTP, and so the URL will just be the URL for that other child workflow inside there. And so now let's go ahead and test this inside here. And so, as I test this workflow, what we should be able to see here is that it's going to run. And now you can kind of see that it is going to be calling to that other workflow, which is going to start doing that work inside there. If I, now go back and we take a look at the the one that I just was working on. No, I'm sorry. I go back to the get new contact from SharePoint, and we drill down. We can see that a whole bunch of these ran inside there. Okay. So just the whole idea that you can start building objects inside your workflows. I showed you in that last example an array. Here's an example of building an object. And we can also see that you can create parent and child workflows, and the parent workflow is going to call the child workflow by making an HTTP request, and then the child workflow is going to have a trigger based on the request, so it gets picked up. And note that you can pass any kind of input data that you want from the parent to the child, and then you can add a response action that shapes the data you pass back to the parent inside there. Okay, we only have about a minute left in our time, but what we talked about today was writing advanced flow expressions, and what you saw is that when you write expressions in Flow with workflow definition language, it gets to be a lot trickier than writing expressions in something like PowerApps or Excel. But now that you've basically seen your way, hopefully that will help you. One last note I want to make, and that is at Critical Path Training, we have some deep dive courses in many topics, including PowerApps and Flow. So our deep dive into PowerApps and Flow course, will really give you a good foundation and have you understand what goes on behind the scenes when you're building PowerApps, you're building flows, and also, beyond just getting into advanced expression writing and advanced techniques in PowerApps and Flow, we also cover building custom connectors. We cover integrating PowerApps and Flow with Power BI and beginning to work with the Common Data Service, and of course, the deployment and application lifecycle management side of working with PowerApps and Flow. So if you do get a chance, please come and see us and come to criticalpathtraining.com if you want some more information on our courses. Thanks very much for attending.